The sudden acquisition of new territories in the United States led to what was known in the 1840s and 1850s as the sectional crisis. We'll take a look at popular sovereignty, the election of 1848, the Compromise of 1850, and then the fall of the Whigs. The picture you see there is of Henry Clay on the floor of the U.S. Senate debating the admission of California to the Union. You see seated to the left Daniel Webster with his head resting on his hand, and on the far right of the picture you see peeking in from the side John C. Calhoun, the men who were at the end of their political careers. This artist's depiction depicts manifest destiny in the form of a woman, as you see the racial aspect of this, a white woman leading the way for civilization as the dark-skinned Indians flee away. There's darkness in the Indian lands, but there's light and sun in the settlement as wagons and then trains and farmers and cattle drovers come further and further west. Popular sovereignty. What had grown in the United States up to this point was abolitionism, the desire to end slavery once and for all, led by people such as Frederick Douglass, the former slave, now lecturer Sojourner Truth. But the abolitionist movement was not monolithic. There were splits in the abolitionist movement. There were radical abolitionists who wanted to end slavery right away, and there were moderates who wanted to contain slavery. They called themselves the Liberty Party, believing that slavery in itself was a bad thing, but it was a bad thing in that it interfered with the natural, quote-unquote, white progress of the nation. And you get to see that not all abolitionists were like Frederick Douglass, who believed in the equality of everyone. They simply believed in the end of slavery.
The territories
it also
for statehood. Would they
split
be
the Whig Party into two groups. You had conscience Whigs who supported moderate abolition.
There came the idea.
And then you had Cotton
Why not
Whigs.
let the democratic
process,
abolition, such as it is,
and they joined with Democrats in enforcing the fugitive slave law in the North. Even if you escaped to the North,
by
there
two
was a
men.
federal law that stated that you had
Stephen Douglas
return a
Illinois,
slave. And you had people that were undercover,
on paper,
always on the lookout for
Just
African Americans who showed signs of being a slave.
For that
and oftentimes
and
you were guilty until proven innocent.
Would be upheld. But there is a dark side to this. In the election of 1848, James K. Polk declined a second term, as I had told you, and he would die only a few months afterwards. The war and the pressure of office had actually worn him very thin and made him old before his time. So the Democrats choose Lewis Cass. The Whigs, they choose the war hero, Zachary Taylor, with Millard Fillmore as his running mate. There's a third party called the Free Soil Party, who believed that the soil of the new territory should remain free because that was the way white America could prosper the most, and they nominate Martin Van Buren, the former president. In a three-way split of the electorate, Zachary Taylor wins a very close contest. Here you see two of the most prominent abolitionists of the time. Frederick Douglass, this is a picture that's taken well after the Civil War. And on the right is Sojourner Truth, who gave the great speech, "Aren't I a Woman?" essentially arguing that not only am I a black person, but I am a black woman. Therefore, I have a double apartheid to overcome. This is a daguerreotype portrait of Stephen A. Douglas from Illinois, the Napoleon of the Senate, as he was called, now one of the new and rising stars of the day. On a very hot July day in 1849, Zachary Taylor dedicated the foundation of the Washington Monument, then proceeded to eat cherries that had not been properly washed. He developed a stomach ailment and died unexpectedly in 1849, and once again the Whig Party was deprived of its standard bearer, just like with William Henry Harrison back in 1841. This led Millard Fillmore to become the president. His Excellency, as he was called. Millard Fillmore was an incredibly average man from Buffalo, New York. And Millard Fillmore, the incredibly average president that he is faced with an incredibly above-average problem in the fact that the state of California is applying for admission to the Union. Gold had been discovered in California in 1848. By 1849 and 1850, more than 100,000 people had flocked to California looking for gold, and with that in mind, they wanted to become a free state. The admission of California now touched off yet another constitutional crisis, which we call the Sectional crisis, because the southern states, led by very old and dying John C. Calhoun, threatened secession from the Union if California were to simply be admitted as a free state. And once again, it is left to the aging Henry Clay to work out his last compromise, which is called the Compromise of 1850. With the help of Douglas
as his assistant, Henry Clay works out the Great Compromise of 1850. California will indeed be allowed to come into the Union as a free state. Now, this will upset the balance in the Senate. The boundary of Texas will be settled, and Texas will be compensated for its lost lands, and that's why Texas looks the way it does today. New Mexico territorial status will be granted, and it will be allowed to have popular sovereignty. They abolished the slave trade in the District of Columbia. There was a slave market just 10 blocks from the White House, and many said that this was a stain on the nation's honor. As a sop to the southern states, they allow a stronger federal fugitive slave law to be written, to have even greater penalties for those who helped slaves escape. Calhoun does not like this, even in this form, and he gives a great speech against it. He's not able to give the speech because he's dying from tuberculosis, so he can only sit in the Senate chamber wrapped in a great cloak and staring at people. Daniel Webster of Massachusetts comes out in favor of the Compromise of 1850, and this sinks this old man's last chance for the presidency. And Henry Clay, as the compromiser, had thought that he would probably get the presidency or have a chance one more time, but this also sinks him in the end. And it's these three men are now leaving the political scene. Calhoun will die in 1850. Soon after the compromise. Webster and Clay will both die later on in the 1850s. And so yet another political generation has passed. With the Compromise of 1850, the Whig Party now begins to fall apart. The slave issue and the fact that the party was too large and too broad finally sunk it, and the fact that they lost both Harrison and Taylor as their leaders also dealt it a lethal blow. Webster, Clay, and Calhoun, as I already said, they fell away from the political spectrum at this point. Their time was over. It was now time for a new, younger generation led by Douglas, Thaddeus Stevens, William Seward, and Abraham Lincoln. And so this map shows you the United States now has reached the Pacific Ocean. Manifest destiny has been fulfilled. All that remains to be added to the continental United States at this point is the Gadsden Purchase of southern Arizona, and that will come along in 1854. But the United States has completed its march to the Pacific. But at what cost? Here you see a picture, an abolitionist paper depicting the effects of the Fugitive Slave Law and what it is doing to African Americans, reducing them to fear and indignity.
You will, of course, recall
our three great war hawks of 1812, Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, and John C. Calhoun. As they reached the zenith of their political careers in the 1830s and the 1840s, you see that they have achieved statesman status. And now, at the end of their lives, you see the haggard look of Daniel Webster, who had a serious drinking problem, Henry Clay, who was simply worn out by the travails of government, and there you see John C. Calhoun. That was a man who, when he looked at you, you knew you were being looked at.